being the best player in Valorant comes with some incredibly comfortable rewards. I'm talking tens of thousands of dollars a month in income, respect from the entire community, and of course, just being able to call yourself the best in one of the biggest games ever released must be a super rewarding feeling. Today, I am going to be going over the best players from every single act of Valorant. And starting with Act 1, we have a player who had previously dominated in another esport for many years, with more than $250,000 in earnings, 60 tournament wins, and a nickname that any player who had ever watched CSGO competitive would have known about. I am talking about the headshot machine, or Scream as he is known today. Now, when Scream made the move from CS over to Valorant, he had quite an advantage over anyone else, simply because of his previous way of playing CSGO. He was always focusing on tapping, something the majority of other pros in CS did not. Spraying is way more common than going around tapping heads. It turns out that Scream's unique ability to tap would help him become the best Valorant player in the early days of the game, as spraying is nowhere near as reliable in Valorant as it is in Counter-Strike. Scream's tournament results in the beginning of the game speaks for themselves. From the beta release on April 7th until the end of Act 1 on August 4th, Scream won 12 tournaments. Now, for Act 1, you could make an argument that Wardell, Mixwell, or Tense was the very best player. Wardell due to his incredible results in NA, Mixwell for his ability to win and adapt to various different teams, and of course Tense for being the very first player to ever reach the rank of Valorant, now, as everyone knows, named Radiant. The reason Scream is the winner is because of how he was able to put up MVP performances consistently in tournaments in Act 1. In comparison to someone like Tense, his tournament results were many times better, and his previous experience from being the headshot machine on CS gave him a skill set that no one was able to match. Moving on over to Act 2, things start to become interesting. There was one team that was unstoppable during this period, and that was G2. From August 4th until October 13th of 2020, they didn't lose a single tournament they participated in, other than a show match. Show matches are games that are rarely played full on serious, so whether you want to count this as an actual game or not is totally up to you. And because of G2's performance, it's only natural that I pick a player from that roster. But before sharing who the best player of Act 2 was, I gotta put some respect on two players I'll call honorable mentions. In the second act of Valorant and the entirety of 2020, a player by the name TakeJ absolutely dominated over on Asia, getting top 3 in literally every single event he played. Unfortunately, outside of Asia and a little later in his career, he wasn't able to see much success at all. But his early days are some of the most dominant out of any player ever from Asia, and because of his results in the start of Valorant, he undeniably deserves an honorable mention. The same can be said for Saipan. Now, Saipan is one of the few players that saw tremendous success in the early days of Valorant that didn't come from CSGO. He actually came from a highly successful career playing competitive Fortnite, having made nearly 70k from tournaments over there. But much like many of the other names on my list, he decided to instantly quit and take a chance on Valorant as soon as the game was teased, a decision that definitely ended up working out for him. In Act 2 alone, he won 3 events he participated in, got second in 2 and third in 1. But of course, there was one player who was just better than anyone else in the world, and that player was Ardis. Ardis with G2 dominated every single event. At this time, there was no other team in the world quite like G2. In addition to winning just about everything, Ardis went on to become the individual player with the most earnings in the world in the year of 2020. Moving on over to the final act of episode 1 and the act that concluded the year of 2020 for Valorant esports, we have Act 3. Now, 2020 was an interesting year. A ton of major top competitors from other games went over to Valorant and saw a ton of success, but unfortunately for everyone who wasn't on G2, it was nearly impossible to stand out individually speaking because of how much light was on their win streak and just how good they were in comparison to everybody else. In Act 3, players like Hiku, Drone, Sinatra, and Haste all put up extremely respectable results, but one individual stood out a little bit from the rest, an underrated player by the name Lowell. Now, Lowell, much like a ton of other hyper-successful early competitors in Valorant, came from a professional career in Counter-Strike. Having played on teams like Mousesports and Dignitas, Lowell was not afraid of some competition. And in Act 3, this really shined through, as Lowell with his teammates on Team Heretics was able to beat out a G2 in an A-tier tournament, all whilst Lowell himself was putting up MVP performances in every game he played. Beating G2 in 2020 was a massive result in itself, but not only did Heretics go on to beat G2 in the semifinals, they also won the entire tournament called First Strike and took home $40,000 collectively as a result. Before moving on, this video is sponsored by CyberGhost VPN. Using a VPN is super smart for a ton of reasons. A VPN is a tool that enables your computer to connect to remote servers from around the world. Your IP address is hidden hidden, allowing you to browse more anonymously, and your entire data is encrypted so that you stay secure when surfing around on the internet. In addition to the obvious security benefits, you can also access loads of content that isn't available in your country on platforms like Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, Amazon Prime, and many more. The beauty of CyberGhost VPN is just how easy it is to use. You can virtually travel to 100 different countries like Japan, the US, Brazil by simply clicking a few buttons. And you can game with friends and other players from around the world. What's also awesome is that with a single CyberGhost VPN subscription, you can protect up to 7 devices simultaneously so that you can share the benefits with friends and family. The software is available on all platforms: Windows, macOS, iOS, Android, and Linux. And using the link at the top of the description below or the pinned comment, you'll get up to 83% off your CyberGhost VPN subscription and 4 months for free. That's €2.03 a month. You also get a 45-day money-back guarantee if you change your mind and 24/7 support if you have any questions. With over 38 million users worldwide and rated excellent on Trustpilot, CyberGhost VPN is your go-to VPN for reliability, security, and of course, affordability. Check it out at the top of the description below or the pinned comment. Circling back on over to the 4th act of Valorant, or as it's called, Episode 2, Act 1, competitive was really starting to blossom. A lot of teams were really putting in time, energy, and hundreds of thousands of dollars invested to make competing in Valorant a successful venture. But we're not here to talk about teams. We're here to talk about the individuals who stood out and performed better than anyone else. During this act, the real potential of all of Sentinel's individuals became incredibly visible. Sinatra, Shazam, Sumbs, Sick, and Dapper all had their own strengths and weaknesses, and the combination of these 5 proved to be a tough challenge to beat for any team competing in Valorant. But although either one of the Sentinel's boys could have been argued to be the best player of the first act of episode 2, I think Nats, who at the time played for Team Gambit, was the best player in the world. And the reason for this was because he was able to, at times, win rounds nobody else in the world would have had a chance at. But looking at him play, it seemed like he was a few months ahead of the majority of other pro players. And with Act 1 of episode 2 and the beginning of 2021, he really got to show what he was good for, as he was able to participate in the VCT qualifiers. And he went through with flying colors. And talking about flying colors, Zened, who represented the beautiful color of purple in Ascend, was the best player of the 2nd act of episode 2. Now, this act lasted from March 2nd until April 27th, and it definitely wasn't only Zened who performed at the very peak of professional play. Some other names you have to mention when talking about episode 2 act 2 is Tense, Soulcast, and Sarak. However, even though all of these players played to an extraordinary extent, Zened was just better. The way he was able to entry frag and open up sites was unlike anyone else at the time. So therefore, he gets the title for best player in the world in episode 2 act 2. The final act of episode 2 has by many been considered the most fun act of Valorant competitive. The reason behind a lot of the hype for this act was because this was when Sentinels, one of the most beloved teams in the world, were just unstoppable. And that was much thanks to a player by the name Tense. The story of Sentinels and Tense is a very interesting one, because Tense wasn't actually officially a part of the organization when they went on their hot streak of winning, so to say, everything. The OGs watching will remember that he actually played for Cloud9 Blue in the beginning of Valorant. And on March 11th of 2021, during the beginning of Act 2 of Episode 2, he was loaned on over to Sen. This loan would go on to prove just how good Tense could be given the right circumstances. From his very first tournament together with them until the end of Act 3, they only didn't win 2 of the events they played together. And most impressively, they ended up winning VCT in Iceland, where the team took home $200,000 altogether. I can sit here all day and talk about Tense, but when talking about Episode 2 Act 3, you can't forget how well Fnatic Dirk played. During the event Tense and Sentinels won, Dirk was the MVP 3 out of the 7 days they played. But unfortunately for him, when it really mattered, Tense and Sentinels were simply better. And therefore, my pick for the best player of Act 3 is Tense. Moving on over to the 3rd episode of Valorant, and the very first act of that one, Team Gambit was once again just absolutely destroying everyone. Nats, who we talked about earlier, could easily be argued to yet again be the best player in the world at this time. But a slightly younger player on Nats' very team stood out a little bit more, and that player was Chronicle. Chronicle, at this time only being 18 years of age, was able to put up impressive numbers in the majority of games he played. His clean and precise style of aiming, coupled with his top-tier game IQ, made him nothing short of the best player in the world. I do also want to give an honorable mention to Ye, who individually performed incredibly. However, at the time he was playing with Team Ambox, and unfortunately this team didn't work out to the same level level of Ye's individual abilities. I'm confident if Ye was given a different set of teammates at this time, he would have been up there with the likes of Chronicle and Team Gambit. It's so fun to look back at these early acts of Valorant. The game has undeniably come a long way, and taking a peek at episode 3 act 2, Ye had finally gotten a new team. At the very end of the first act of episode 3, he joined Team Envy to play alongside more compatible teammates compared to his old org of Ambox. Now, although Ye was able to join a team of an objectively higher caliber, one thing remained consistent, and that was the fact that Ye was carrying the games they played. He was putting up numbers that no one else on the team ever came close to, and he consistently did so in the most important tournaments they played when all the pressure was on him to perform, really showcasing what kind of competitor he was. Also gotta say, we can't talk about this act without giving a massive shout out to CNED yet again. CNED at this point in time just seemed like he was made for the game. Everything he did was incredibly high tier. The mistakes were few, and he was overall one of the very best. But regardless, I have Ye as the best player of episode 3 act 2. Talking about the very best, it is time we talk about Zeke, who during episode 3 act 3 was the absolute best player in the world. The reason I give him the title is simply because he was able to win VCT at the end of 2021. And not only did he win, but he was also the MVP of the final game against none other than Gambit Esports. Leading up to the finals, Zeke and Ascend played insanely well, beating out Team Secret and Team Liquid easily by winning 2-0 over both of these teams. Then in the finals, winning 3-2 over Gambit and taking home $350,000 collectively. What made Zeke better than anyone else was his ability to target switch from player to player with better accuracy than most, his chemistry with the A-Star team, and dare I say, the best movement in the world. Episode 4 Act 1 marked the start of 2022 and yet again a new year for Valorant esports. And with that came a lot of new promising players as well. And one of these players stood out more than the rest. Heck, more than even the best current professional players at the time. And that player was Aspas. Aspas got given an opportunity to play in the org Loud, and he made sure to make the most out of it. Already in his first match playing under the name Loud Aspas, he went on to clearly become MVP of the tournament they also won. Not surprisingly, considering his aim looks like crisp, clean aimbot. His mouse movements and accuracy is beyond impressive, and during VCT challengers, he simply put on a show. Another player that undeniably also must be mentioned during this time, once again, is Ye. At this time, he was also putting in the work, getting MVPs after MVPs, and truthfully, carrying Optic. The second act of episode 4 is the halfway point of all Valorant acts released to this day. It lasted from March 1st until April 27th, and during this period of time, a prodigy from Asia really made his mark. The player I'm talking about is of course Forsaken. Already at the end of March, Forsaken and Paper X was able to win VCT challengers and the 30k that came with it. And the MVP during that tournament win was Forsaken himself. 26 days later, they would go on to play VCT Masters in Iceland and finish 4th, only barely losing out to Zeta. But although Forsaken and Paper X ended 4th, Forsaken was still able to get a playoffs MVP due to him playing at the very peak of what was possible competitively at the time. For this act, I want to point at Scream yet again as an honorable mention. During VCT in Iceland, he had the highest KDA out of anyone attending, really showcasing his impact as a player. For the final act of episode 4, Marved was the very best player. During 2022 in its entirety, Marved ended up being the second highest earner in all of competitive Valorant, only second to the very best player of that entire year and his teammate, Ye. Marved's best quality as a player is being an impact player. He knows exactly what he needs to do in order to set his team up for success, whether he plays Brim, Omen or Viper. The lack of ego and understanding that if he was consistently able to set Ye up for success, the team would do fantastic. These were the characteristics that made him the very best player in the world. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters as a Valorant player is being someone who's able to secure round wins. And Marved, well, he did that to a better extent than anyone else in the world in episode 4, act 3. Episode 5, act 1 on the other side had a totally different GOAT. And that someone was Jing. Jing and Paper X during this act was nearly unstoppable. In VCT Masters in Copenhagen, they did actually get beat by FPX 3-2. However, even when losing, Jing stood out and performed incredibly. Their way of playing during this time was very different to most other teams, and I think that was one of the main reasons behind their success in 2022. Of course, that coupled with Jing's insane ability to utilize all of Raze's utility to probably the highest standard out of any player who has ever touched Valorant. For this act, I also gotta give out 2 honorable mentions. One to Saipan, who we super early in this video talked about, but also FNS. players. For episode 5, Act 2, there was a clear team that was better than anyone else, and that team was Loud. They were so good that they were able to take out Optic in the finals of Valorant Champions of 2022. They did so by winning 3-1, and the result was 300 grand in earnings collectively for the team, and the redemption from when they lost 0-3 to Optic in Iceland just 5 months prior. And the best player from this act was Les, being one of the smartest lurkers the game has ever seen. He was able to make game-winning impact plays time and time again. The best quality Les has, however, is probably just how calm he's able to be, regardless of circumstances. A characteristic that comes in handy when you're playing the best teams in the world for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The third act of episode 5 marked the end of yet another year for Valorant esports. And although during this act not a lot of competitive events were running, a player that had been around for a very long time still stood out from the rest as the best player in the world, and that was Dirk. It was about time we finally got to talk about one of the most talented players this game has ever seen. You could argue that he was the best way earlier than this act, but during this one his aim was nearly flawless and his ability to read situations were extraordinary. Dirk, or Dirka, is one of the most well-rounded players that has ever touched the game, and he will undeniably go down in history as one of the GOATs. Moving on over to episode 6, we once again started seeing some events being hosted, and the biggest one was VCT in Brazil. During this massive event, Dirk's very teammate was the best player in the world, Fnatic Leo. Now, I know I earlier said that Seek might have the best movement in the world, but when talking about Leo, we yet again gotta talk about god tier movement. Both Seek and Leo move in so incredibly unique fashions. What makes Leo so incredible is that he is not only able to consistently give himself easy shots to hit, but he also makes sure he is an incredibly tough target for his opponents. By the way, he is moving back and forth and taking duels. During this act and the Brazilian VCT, Leo ended up as the MVP of the entire tournament, and because of his efforts, he was able to take home 100k for his boys in Fnatic. I'm going to sound like a broken record talking about these Fnatic players, but in the second act of episode 6, you just can't deny that Alphayear was the best player in the world. This guy's story is honestly extremely interesting, as he was given an opportunity to play with the likes of Fnatic coming from basically nothing, and he didn't only take the opportunity and perform like expected, but he surpassed everyone's expectations times 100 and basically just became one of the best players in the entire world after joining the org. Being able to not fall to the pressure of joining the players that are already at the top of competitive Valorant, and honestly, after only a few weeks with the team, performing even better than the players on there is just unbelievably impressive. What makes him so incredibly good is how he's able to flick from one opponent to another, with a mouse movement that's lightning fast, and always being able to pitch perfectly, stop as soon as he lands on the head of the opposition. This quality often allows him to win duels even if he gets swung by 2 players. He is one of the few players in the world who has the ability to do that. The final act of episode 6 marked the start of summer of 2023 and even more major tournaments. For this act, you could argue that Aspas was the very best, and I would not hate on that opinion at all, because he was putting up some devilishly good numbers in the VCT Americas League. Could also say that Boaster deserves the title for best player of this very act, as Fnatic won VCT Masters in Tokyo. However, Ethan from EG was in my book the very best player. He was enabling his team to perform way better than what should have been legal due to him simply being the best in the world at using utility. He is by many pros considered one of the most annoying to play against, which is nothing but a massive compliment. Episode 7, Act 1 is one of the greatest acts ever of competitive Valorant. Or, as a matter of fact, it probably is the single greatest act of Valorant. This is mainly because of the massive Valorant Champions tournament that was hosted, with a prize pool of $2.25 million. And with the winning team taking home $1 million, this was by far the biggest Valorant tournament ever hosted, and a real opportunity for teams from all around the world to prove that they had what was needed to perform when the pressure was turned all the way to the max. Luckily for the very best player in the world at this time, he has a very unfair advantage, and that is that he simply never feels pressure. This characteristic, it came in handy and granted him the most valuable player award in the most important tournament in Valorant's history. If you didn't already connect the dots, the player I'm talking about is Demon 1. Now, it's rare that we see these aim demons with very satisfying playstyles be able to beat out the best players in the world, because cool looking ways of playing doesn't always mean that you're actually good at winning rounds and performing at the highest caliber. But Demon 1, he is able to do both, and because of that, there is no denying that he was the best player in episode 7, Act 1. For the second act of episode 7, it's a little harder to say exactly who was the best. This is because Valorant decided to have a disturbingly long off-season from competitive events, which means that we have no hard numbers on who performed the best. But in my eyes, the best player in Act 2 was Verno. Now, you might not have heard about Verno, but he is a 17-year-old up-and-coming player who, by the look of things, have all the confidence needed to become one of the top players in the coming years. In this act, he also got the chance to play at a LAN event, one in which he won against Team QOR, and he also ended up being the MVP of that tournament by a long shot, having almost 2 KD playing against veteran pro players. For the final act of episode 7, Something was the best player in the world. This act concluded the year of 2023, and Something ended on $97K in earnings, which was incredibly impressive considering this was his first real year of being able to compete against other players of his caliber. Something is one of the most clutch players in all of Valorant. He's able to win rounds that very few others would have even come close to being able to win. This is most likely a result of his lightning quick reaction time and top tier aim. Going into 2024, I'm sure we will see way more of what Something has to offer competitively speaking. And talking about 2024, episode 8, act 1 is the first act that starts and ends in this year. Again, quite hard to pinpoint the best player this early on, but in my eyes, Soulcast is now the best player. He's currently playing in tier 2, but the way he is hitting shots and showing confidence just proves that he doesn't belong there. So hopefully he'll be able to qualify through and get into VCT yet again. I also want to give an honorable mention to one of Soulcast's teammates, Kayak. He is another young player who just now has been given a chance to play with some extremely good players. In 2024, I'm confident we will see more of this guy, given that he arguably has some of the best aim in the entirety of EU. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to check out the CyberGhost VPN offer for €2.03 a month in the description below, or the pinned comment for full protection when surfing the internet, as well as full access to content from all around the world.